In the brutal cold of minus 20 degrees Celsius, a mother dog pushed through the deep snow, carrying her newborn puppy gently in her mouth. She hadn't eaten for days. Her strength was almost gone, yet she kept moving toward the only place she believed she could trust. Not far away, a Navy SEAL was working in a quiet northern town, unaware that a life-changing encounter was about to happen. When the exhausted German Shepherd finally reached him, what he discovered behind her was more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a secret that had been buried in the town for many years, one that would shake the entire community. Before we begin, let us know where you were watching from, share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more meaningful stories. Morning came hard to Pine Vale. Not loud, not cruel in the obvious ways, just hard. The kind of northern cold that did not howl for attention, but pressed itself into wood, metal, bone, and patience until everything revealed what it was truly made of. By dawn, the small town sat under a white stillness so complete it looked almost holy. Roof lines wore clean edges of snow. Pines stood dark and disciplined against a pale sky. The roads had not disappeared, but they had narrowed into uncertain corridors between banks of wind-packed frost. And at the far end of town, where the last houses gave up pretending they belonged to civilization and the forest began to reclaim the map, a single old house stood with smoke stains on the chimney and no fresh groceries in the cupboard. That was where Harold Voss lived. Harold was 76 and built now like a man the weather had been slowly folding inward for years. He was thin in the shoulders, slightly bent at the back, with fine silver hair combed carefully over a scalp too often kissed by cold light. His face was lined, not by vanity's enemies, but by old winters, quiet grief, and the sort of endurance that never bothered to call itself noble. His hands shook sometimes when he buttoned his coat, but they were still gentle hands. The kind that fixed broken radios, warmed soup slowly, and always tore soft food into smaller pieces before setting it down for a dog. The dog had come to him months earlier as a shadow with ribs. A female German Shepherd, black and tan, though winter hunger had dulled her coat and thinned the proud fullness nature had meant for it. Harold had named her Era after hearing the word once on an old radio program about northern myths. Snow Mercy, the program had said. He liked that. It sounded like something fragile that had decided to stay alive out of spite. Era had the long, clean muzzle of a working dog, dark amber-brown eyes that seemed too thoughtful for comfort, and upright ears that only softened when exhaustion made truth impossible to hide. She had grown round with pregnancy in the past weeks, but not with abundance. Her body still showed the discipline of survival. She was lean even now, carrying life while half-starved herself, as if motherhood had arrived before safety did. Harold had done what he could. That phrase sounds noble when said from a distance. Up close, it meant half a can of stew stretched into 2 meals, old blankets folded into a nest near the heater, and one elderly man counting coins beneath a yellow kitchen bulb while pretending not to notice how little there was left. Era survived because Harold loved her, but also because sometimes the world offered crumbs of decency just often enough to postpone tragedy. Bonnie Kessler was one of those crumbs. She lived 3 houses up when the road was passable, and in better weather she sometimes left a half bag of kibble on Harold's porch, or a plastic container of broth gone lukewarm, but still useful. Bonnie was 58, broad-faced and kind, in the weathered way of women who had spent their lives making ordinary things hold together. Her brown hair, streaked with silver, was usually tied back in a hurried knot. She dressed in a navy winter parka and sensible boots and had the habit of speaking gently until someone mistook it for weakness. Then her eyes sharpened enough to correct them. There were others too, now and then. Someone from church with stale bread, a mechanic's wife who emptied leftovers into a paper tray, a boy delivering newspapers who once poured fresh water into Era's bowl because he had noticed the ice rim forming before noon. That was how Era had lived, not because anyone had fully taken responsibility, except Harold, but because pity arrived in fragments. And fragments can keep something alive until the weather becomes stronger than sentiment. By the 3rd day of the cold front, Pinevale had dropped to 20 below. Doors stayed shut longer. Curtains remained drawn. Kindness became logistical. People still cared, perhaps, but care that requires boots, windburn, and a hand on an iron gate before sunrise often gets postponed into something more comfortable. The roads worsened. Snow climbed over tire tracks and erased intention. What had been a difficult walk became a dangerous one. Harold knew the food would not last another day. So before noon, he pulled on his old brown-gray coat, wrapped a wool scarf twice around his neck, and told Era he would not be long. She stood by the door watching him, her body heavy with approaching birth, her eyes following the slow work of his hands as he tugged on his gloves. He bent down with the careful stiffness of age and touched her head once. "I know," he murmured. "I know, girl." Then he stepped out into the white. By late afternoon, he had not come back. At the opposite edge of town, Silas Boone was shoveling packed snow away from a utility entrance behind the volunteer winter response station. He was 34, about 6'2", with the controlled build of a man whose strength had been earned in function rather than display. Broad through the shoulders, lean at the waist, compact in every movement. The kind of body that did not waste effort. His face was clean-shaven, sharply cut by a square jaw and defined cheekbones. Dark brown hair sat close in a military crop, slightly longer than regulation would have allowed in the old days. His skin was fair under the weathering of northern wind, and his eyes, gray-blue, cold at first glance, had the watchful stillness of someone who had spent too many years studying danger before speaking to it. He wore what he always wore when work needed doing, a worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt softened by use, faded at the shoulders and frayed at the cuffs, old moss-brown combat pants, weather-beaten military work boots, and a black-faced military watch with scratches that had long ago stopped mattering. Nothing about him asked to be admired. Everything about him suggested readiness. Silas had been in Pine Vale for 10 days, helping train the town's volunteer winter rescue team on route safety, cold weather extraction, and what to do when panic became more dangerous than the storm. He had retired from the Navy SEALs on paper. Inside himself, the transition was less convincing. People in town called him calm. People who knew men like him better would have called him contained. There was a difference. Earlier that week, driving past the last row of houses, Silas had noticed a black and tan German shepherd standing near an old porch, belly low with pregnancy. He had stopped only because the dog's water dish was frozen into a shallow disk of cloudy ice. He broke it with the heel of his glove, poured in warm water from a thermos, and drove on. The second time he saw her, she was lying curled against the house while an elderly man carried in groceries that were too light to be reassuring. The third time, she was standing in the road, watching from a distance while Silas helped push a stranded pickup free of a snowbank. She had not come near him then, but she had watched. Silas did not know she was taking inventory. By evening, the world had gone quieter in the way that meant danger was settling in. At Harold's house, Era circled twice before lowering herself into the nest of old blankets in a worn green sweater Harold had left beside the heater weeks earlier. The room smelled of coal wood, old radio dust, and the fading trace of the man who should have been home by now. Outside, the wind scraped along the walls and moved on. Inside, labor began. It was not cinematic. It was lonely. Era worked through it in silence, broken only by breath, instinct, and the occasional low sound that seemed less like pain than effort pulled tight. One puppy came first, small, slick, alive. Then another, weaker, slower. A third never truly arrived into the world with enough strength to bargain for it. The house gave her no help. The town offered no witness. She cleaned them, curled around them, nudged them toward milk her own body struggled to produce. The stronger one rooted blindly with desperate determination. The weaker one whimpered, then shivered, then fell quiet enough to frighten even the dark. Era lifted her head every few minutes toward the door, listening, waiting. No steps, no coat rustle, no Harold. Hours passed. The bowl in the kitchen sat empty. The water near the back door had filmed over with cold. The heater clicked, then failed, then clicked again. Era licked the puppies, pressed them close, tried to settle. But some knowledge older than language was waking inside her now. Waiting had become its own kind of threat. Close to dawn, when the room had turned the color of weak ash and the weaker puppy's breasts had thinned to nearly nothing, Era rose on trembling legs and left the nest. She crossed the room not toward food, there was none, nor toward the door first, but toward the old chair where Harold always sat. There, hanging from one armrest, was the glove he had used the last morning he was home. Era lowered her nose to it and stood perfectly still. Not grieving, not confused, listening to something inside herself settle into decision. When she turned away, it was not the turn of an animal hoping. It was the turn of one that had run out of every option except judgment. Silas was inside the station when she found him. He had just come in from checking chain traction on one of the emergency vehicles and was rubbing warmth back into his hands when the outer door scraped, opened a fraction, and failed to close behind the wind. One of the volunteers started to get up, but Silas was already moving. At first, he saw only motion low to the ground. Then he saw the dog. She was thinner than he remembered. Her black and tan coat was dusted white along the spine and shoulders, fur roughened by cold and neglect. Her legs shook so hard it looked painful to remain standing. In her mouth, held with astonishing care, was a puppy wrapped in nothing but her own determination. The room changed. Even the volunteers, all chatter and tired jokes a moment before, went silent with the primitive understanding that real need had just crossed their threshold. Era came straight to Silas, not to the warmest corner, not to the nearest person, to him. She laid the puppy down against the toe of his boot and looked up. Her amber-dark eyes were ringed by exhaustion, but there was no frenzy in them, no wild pleading, only a terrible, deliberate focus. The weaker kind of desperation asked for anything. This was not that. This was a creature placing one fragile life into the hands of the only person she had decided might not fail it. Silas crouched instantly. The puppy was alive, barely, small enough to fit into both his hands, cold through the fur. Breathing shallow, irregular little sips, he slid one palm under its body and tucked it inside his shirt against the heat of his chest without thinking about the room or the watching faces. Then he looked back at Era. She had not lain down. She had not asked for food. She had turned halfway toward the door again. "Where?" Silas said quietly. One of the volunteers muttered, "No way." But Era took a step, looked back, and took another. Silas felt something old and unwelcome move through him then, not fear exactly, but recognition. Years ago, in another coal place, he had ignored a smaller sign than this because there had not been enough proof. By the time proof arrived, it had also arrived too late. Not again. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and spoke over his shoulder without raising his voice. "Heat pack, towels, call Doc Fenley. I'm bringing another one in if there is one." The volunteers moved because men and women tend to move when someone sounds like they have already seen the end of indecision. Outside, the cold hit like a verdict. Era had already started down the road, staggering more than walking. Silas followed, boots biting into packed snow, one hand protecting the puppy against his body. The route she chose told him more than panic would have. She cut past the gas station, ignored the church lane, bypassed two closer houses with porch lights still on, and kept going toward the far edge of town. Not random, selected. The sky was beginning to pale when the old Voss house came into view. At that distance, it looked less like a home than something winter had almost convinced the world to forget. One window held a faint grayness. The porch sagged under drifted snow. The front walk had nearly vanished. Era reached the steps and faltered. Silas got to her as she sank hard to her haunches, then forced herself upright again as if collapse were a private matter she intended to postpone. He opened the door and the smell met him first. Cold ash, old wood, birth, fear. Inside, the room was dim and still. Too still. On the floor near the heater, half buried in blankets, lay another puppy. And beside the empty chair, the ghost of a home interrupted too fast. Silas did not yet know Harold Voss's name. He did not yet know where the old man had gone, why the house felt as though someone had left in the middle of a sentence, or why the dog at his side had chosen him out of all the living people in Pine Vale. He only knew one thing with the force of certainty. This had started before dawn, and it had not started with the puppies. Silas Boone had seen many kinds of silence in his life. The silence after gunfire, the silence after rescue helicopters lifted away, the silence that followed a man realizing he had survived something that would live inside him for years. But the silence inside Harold Voss's house felt different. It was not empty. it felt interrupted. Silas stood just inside the doorway, snow melting slowly from his boots onto the worn wooden floor. The air inside the house was colder than it should have been, but not yet frozen solid. That meant someone had been here not too long ago. The heater near the wall clicked occasionally, struggling against the temperature outside, but the room still held the faint ghost of warmth. Era moved past him first. Her body looked thinner now that the urgency of the run had drained what little strength she had left. The black saddle of her coat was dusted with frost, and the golden fur along her chest and legs had dulled into something rough and wind-tangled. Yet she walked with purpose, head low, ears slightly forward, moving toward the nest she had left only hours before. Silas followed, careful with every step. The second puppy lay wrapped in old blankets beside the heater, barely moving. Its tiny chest rose in fragile, uneven breaths. Silas knelt quickly and slipped 2 fingers under its belly, warm enough to save. That was all the information he needed. He tucked the puppy inside his jacket beside the first one, creating a living pocket of warmth against his chest. The little body twitched weakly, pressing instinctively toward heat. A good sign. Not victory, just a chance. Behind him, Era sank slowly onto the floor, not collapsing, just stopping. Her breathing came heavy now, ribs lifting under her thin coat. Silas glanced at her, noting the tremor in her legs, the slight dullness creeping into those amber-dark eyes that had been so fiercely focused only minutes ago. "You did your part," he murmured quietly. The words meant nothing to the dog in language, but tone mattered. Dogs understood tone better than most humans did. Era lowered her head, resting her muzzle on the blanket near where the puppies had been. For the first time since she had appeared at the rescue station, she allowed herself to be still. Silas stood and began scanning the room. The house was small but tidy, in the way older men often kept their homes when they had spent a lifetime learning how little space a person actually needed. A narrow kitchen opened to the right. A small wooden table sat beneath a single yellow bulb, its light dim and tired but still working. 2 chairs were pushed close together, one slightly angled away as if someone had stood up quickly and forgotten to straighten it. The smell of the place carried a mix of old wood, radio solder, and winter clothing that had dried near heat too many times. It was the smell of someone living quietly. On the table sat a pair of reading glasses beside a folded newspaper dated 2 days earlier. Silas looked toward the coat rack near the door. One empty hook, another hook held a thick wool scarf. An old pair of gloves hung loosely from the nail beneath it. If Harold Voss had gone somewhere intentionally, he had left without taking half the things a 76-year-old man needed in 20 below weather. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not panic, calculation. He stepped toward the small kitchen. The cupboard door stood half open. Inside, 2 cans of soup and a nearly empty bag of rice sat beside a jar of instant coffee. The refrigerator hummed softly. Inside, 1 onion, a bottle of mustard, and a carton of milk that had frozen solid. The sink held a single metal bowl, a dog bowl, dry. The scene told a story Silas knew well. Not poverty exactly, just someone living too close to the edge of it. Boots scraped outside the porch. Silas turned toward the door instantly. A woman stepped in, brushing snow from the shoulders of a navy parka. "Good Lord!" Bonnie Kessler stopped halfway across the threshold. Her face carried the open concern of someone who had already feared what she might find. Bonnie was a woman of medium height with strong shoulders and steady hands that looked used to work rather than decoration. Her brown hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back beneath a knitted hat. Her cheeks were flushed from cold, and her eyes widened when she saw Era on the floor. "Oh, sweetheart," Bonnie whispered. She dropped to one knee beside the dog without hesitation, gloved fingers brushing gently along Era's neck. "She found someone, didn't she?" Silas nodded. "She brought a puppy to the station." Bonnie exhaled slowly, relief and sadness mixing in the sound. "I tried coming yesterday," she said quietly, "but the road drifted shut halfway down the block. Harold told me not to risk it if the storm got worse." Her eyes drifted around the room. "Where is he?" Silas answered honestly. "I don't know." Bonnie looked toward the empty chair near the table. "That man never left her alone during something like this." Silas studied her face carefully. Did he go out today? Bonnie shook her head slowly. He went yesterday afternoon. Said he needed to pick up food before the roads got worse. Her lips pressed thin. That was the last anyone saw him. Silas turned toward the window. Outside, the pale gray of morning had begun spreading across the snow. If Harold had gone missing in this weather, time mattered. Silas checked the heater again, adjusting its position closer to where Era rested. Bonnie disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a kettle. Water pipe's still running, she said, barely. She filled the kettle and placed it carefully on the stove. You from the rescue team? She asked, glancing at Silas. Helping train them, he replied. She studied him for a moment. You're the tall one with the quiet voice. When Silas allowed the smallest hint of a smile. That's one description. Bonnie looked back toward Era. She always watched you when you drove past. Silas raised an eyebrow. She did? Bonnie nodded. Dogs know things before people do. As Bonnie spoke, Era suddenly lifted her head. Not slowly, sharply. Her ears rose, catching something neither human had heard. She struggled to stand, legs shaking, then took 2 uncertain steps toward the back hallway. Silas and Bonnie exchanged a glance. Another puppy? Bonnie whispered. Era stopped halfway down the hall and turned back. Not barking, not whining, just staring, waiting. Silas followed. The hallway led to a small bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and a dresser that had probably been built before either of them were born. A single window overlooked the snow-covered trees behind the house. Nothing moved inside. But Era walked past the bed, past the dresser, to the far corner where an old wooden cabinet stood half-hidden behind stacked toolboxes. She nudged it once with her nose. Then again. Silas crouched beside it. The cabinet door was not locked. Inside sat a small metal toolbox and a stack of weathered envelopes tied with twine. At the very bottom lay a cassette recorder, no larger than a paperback book. Silas lifted it carefully. Bonnie leaned closer. Harold hasn't used that thing in years, she said. Silas turned it over. A piece of tape had been stuck across the back. Handwritten in careful block letters. If something happens, don't trust the first story you hear. Silas stared at the words for a long moment. Not a diary entry, not a label. A warning. He set the recorder back gently. Bonnie, he said quietly. Did Harold ever mention trouble? Bonnie shook her head. No enemies, no debts, no family left except distant cousins who forgot his address 20 years ago. She hesitated. Well, Silas waited. There was one thing, she admitted. What? Past couple months, he kept saying someone had been driving past the house late at night. Same car, same headlights. Silas felt the cold in the room deepen. What kind of car? Bonnie frowned slightly. Silver sedan, I think. Silas glanced toward the window. Snow outside had erased almost every trace of movement from the previous day. Almost. Near the edge of the yard, half hidden beneath drifted powder, a faint curved depression cut across the surface. A tire mark. Not recent, but not old enough to belong to last week either. Silas walked outside slowly. The air struck his lungs like ice. He crouched near the mark. The tread pattern was shallow now under windblown snow, but it angled toward the road leading out of town. A sedan could have passed here, or stopped, or turned around. Behind him, the front door creaked open again. Bonnie stepped onto the porch with Era limping weakly at her side. The dog looked toward the road, not with fear, with the same focused attention she had shown the moment she chose Silas. Bonnie followed the direction of her gaze. You see something? She asked quietly. Silas stood. Maybe. Era did not move. She simply stared toward the bend in the road where the trees closed in. Silas felt the old instinct from his years in the team settle over his thoughts. Patterns. Timing. The difference between coincidence and preparation. Someone had been watching this house, maybe recently, maybe more than once, and Harold Voss had expected trouble badly enough to leave behind a message. Silas looked back toward the doorway where the 2 fragile puppies now slept against his chest. Whatever had happened here, it had started before the storm, and somewhere beyond the frozen curve of that road, someone already knew more about it than they should. The morning after the discovery did not feel like morning. It felt like something had shifted under the surface of Pine Vale. Snow still covered everything with the same quiet discipline as before, but Silas Boone sensed the change the way people who had spent years reading environments often did, through absence. There were fewer tire tracks on the road, fewer porch lights left on overnight. Even the wind seemed to move differently through the pine trees beyond Harold Voss's house, as if the land itself were holding a breath. Inside the small house, warmth had begun to return in fragile pockets. Bonnie Kessler had coaxed the stove into working properly and filled the kettle again. Steam gathered near the ceiling in thin white ribbons that caught the pale light of morning. The heater hummed with more confidence now, though it still fought a losing battle against the cold pressing through the old wooden walls. Silas sat at the table. Both puppies were wrapped in towels inside a cardboard box beside him, positioned near the stove. Their tiny bodies were warmer now, small movements stirring beneath the cloth. One squeaked weakly, searching blindly for the comfort that instinct promised, but reality had delayed. Era lay on the rug near the heater. She had not moved much since the previous night. Her sides rose and fell slowly, exhaustion settling into her muscles after the long hours of birth and the desperate journey through the snow. Yet her eyes remained open. Those amber dark eyes followed every movement in the room. Not anxiously, just carefully. Silas had seen that look before in working dogs overseas. It was the look of an animal that did not waste energy on panic because it believed observation would matter more. Bonnie poured hot water into 2 mugs and slid one across the table toward him. "You didn't sleep," she said. It was not a question. Silas shook his head slightly. Didn't seem like the right time. Bonnie sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the mug. "You talk like a man who's spent a lot of nights like that." Silas did not answer directly. Instead, he looked toward the door, then toward the quiet bedroom where the old cabinet still stood half open. "People leave signals when they're worried," he said, Bonnie's brow furrowed. "You mean Harold?" Silas nodded. He expected something. Bonnie blew softly across the top of her coffee. Harold expected plenty of things. Most of them were about winter storms and bad plumbing. Silas looked back at her. This one was different. Bonnie's expression softened with reluctant agreement. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was." By mid-morning, the rescue station had sent someone else. Deputy Ellen Rowe arrived just after 10. She stepped out of a county patrol SUV that had the dull gray look of vehicles that had spent too many winters battling road salt and drifting snow. Elin moved with the efficient posture of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation made situations worse. She was 42, tall enough to carry authority without effort, her build lean and practical rather than imposing. Her hair, dark blonde shading toward ash, was tied back in a low knot beneath a black knit cap. A few pale strands had escaped along her temples, giving her a slightly wind-worn look that matched the town she served. Her face was narrow, composed, with clear gray eyes that had seen more small-town tragedies than most people would guess. She removed her gloves slowly before stepping onto the porch. Silas opened the door before she could knock. "You Boone or so?" she asked. "That's me." She nodded once and stepped inside. Deputy Rowe had the manner of someone who wasted neither words nor gestures. Her uniform coat remained zipped halfway, the badge on her chest dull under the room's yellow light. Her gaze swept the room quickly. The stove, the cardboard box, the dog. Her eyes paused on Era. "Well," Elin said quietly, "that explains the call I got from Bonnie." Bonnie stood from the table. "She saved them," Bonnie said. Deputy Rowe looked at Silas. "That right?" Silas shrugged slightly. "She found the help." Elin crouched near the box and lifted the corner of the towel carefully. The puppies wriggled faintly. She allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. "Tough little things." Then she stood and turned toward the table again. "Now tell me about Harold." Silas explained what they had found. Not everything. He left out the exact wording of the warning on the cassette for the moment, but enough to describe the empty house, the cabinet, and the fact that Harold had apparently left the previous day and never returned. Deputy Rowe listened without interrupting. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "Storm's been brutal," she said. "People disappear in worse weather than this." Bonnie shook her head immediately. Harold's careful. Deputy Rowe glanced at her. So were a lot of people we've lost over the years. Bonnie's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue further. Elin turned back to Silas. Any signs of injury? Struggle? Blood? No. Tracks? Not many left. The deputy nodded thoughtfully. We'll search the main road and the lake trail. That's where most accidents happen in this kind of weather. Silas leaned back slightly in his chair. Before you do that, he said calmly, you might want to look at something. He walked to the bedroom and returned with a small cassette recorder. Deputy Rowe raised an eyebrow. Harold leave that? Yes. Silas turned it over so she could read the tape. Her eyes moved across the message. The room grew very quiet. Elin did not react dramatically. She simply stared at the words longer than expected, then looked up again. What story? She asked. That's what we'd like to know, Silas replied. Era rose slowly from the rug, not with the exhaustion she had shown earlier, with attention. Her ears lifted, her head turned toward the front window. Silas noticed immediately. Deputy Rowe followed his gaze. Outside, a vehicle rolled slowly past the house. Not fast, not loud, just deliberate. A silver sedan. The car did not stop. It moved down the road toward the bend in the trees and disappeared beyond the hill. No one spoke for several seconds. Bonnie whispered first. That's the same one. Silas looked at the empty road. What same one, Meshitun? Bonnie swallowed. The one Harold kept talking about. Deputy Rowe stepped to the window. Her expression did not change, but her voice carried a harder edge when she spoke. Did you catch the plate? Silas shook his head. Snow glare. The deputy remained at the window a moment longer before turning back into the room. Could be nothing, she said, but the tone of her voice said she no longer believed that. The afternoon passed under a strange tension. Deputy Rowe radioed in a request for 2 volunteers to begin checking the road leading toward the lake. She also sent word to the small clinic in town to expect 2 newborn animals needing care. Doc Martin Fenley arrived shortly after noon. Fenley was the town's only veterinarian and something of a local institution. At 63, he had the relaxed stoop of a man who had spent decades bending over animals that weighed anywhere from 3 pounds to 800. His hair was white but thick, his beard trimmed close along his jaw. His round glasses always seemed to be sliding down the bridge of his nose. He carried a black medical bag that had seen more winters than most of the buildings in Pine Vale. Well now, Fenley said as he stepped inside, I heard we've got a pair of fighters. He knelt beside the box. His large hands moved gently as he checked the puppy's breathing and warmth. Lucky timing, he murmured. Another hour in that cold and we'd be telling a different story. Silas folded his arms. They'll make it? Fenley nodded slowly, with heat, milk replacer, and patience. He glanced toward Era. And she? Silas looked over. The dog had returned to her place near the heater, but her eyes remained fixed on the door. Fenley followed the gaze. She's waiting, he said softly. For Harold? Fenley shrugged. For the world to settle. Late in the afternoon, Deputy Rowe stepped outside to take another call. The sky had turned pale again as the sun sank behind thick winter clouds. Silas joined her on the porch. The air had sharpened even more. Search team found anything? He asked. Rowe shook her head. Nothing yet. She leaned against the railing. You ever notice something strange about small towns? She said. Silas waited. Everyone thinks they know everything about everyone else. She looked back toward the house. Until the moment they don't. Silas glanced down the road. The bend where the silver sedan had vanished now sat empty under gathering shadows. Harold expected trouble, he said. Rowe nodded slowly. And someone's already driving by to see how much we know. Silas checked the time on his old military watch. Evening was coming again. Inside the house, 2 fragile lives had been pulled back from the edge. But outside, the road that cut through the snow toward the forest now carried a different kind of weight. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone had decided it was time to check whether Harold Voss was still able to speak. The cold deepened as the evening came. By late afternoon, the sky above Pine Vale had turned into a flat, colorless ceiling, the kind that swallowed sunlight before it had a chance to warm anything. Snow along the road had hardened into pale ridges where tires had once passed. The world outside Harold Voss's house looked calm in the quiet way winter often pretended to be harmless. Inside, the house had begun to feel different. Not warm exactly, but alive again. The small stove crackled softly, fed by a few pieces of split wood Bonnie had found stacked beneath the back porch. The kettle simmered on low heat. The cardboard box beside the table now held two puppies, wrapped in clean towels that Dr. Martin Fenley had left behind. Their breathing was stronger now. Tiny paws twitched occasionally beneath the cloth as they slept, their fragile bodies still learning the world outside the womb. Era remained on the rug near the heater. She had eaten a little broth that Bonnie coaxed into a bowl and drank slowly from Silas's gloved hand earlier. Her strength was returning in small, cautious increments. The black and tan coat along her back had begun to dry near the heater, revealing again the shape of a powerful working dog beneath the exhaustion. Even now, despite everything, she carried the quiet dignity of her breed. German shepherds were not animals that surrendered easily. Silas Boone leaned against the window frame, watching the road. The view from Harold's house stretched across a narrow stretch of snow-packed road that curved toward a cluster of dark pine trees. Beyond that bend lay the older part of Pine Vale, the roads that led toward the frozen lake, the abandoned lumberyard, and a handful of scattered cabins that belonged to people who preferred distance to neighbors. Silas checked his watch. The search team Deputy Rowe had sent toward the lake had been gone nearly 2 hours. Long enough to worry. Bonnie stepped beside him with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're wearing a path in the floor," she said gently. Silas took the mug, but didn't look away from the window. "Just thinking." Bonnie followed his gaze. "You think Harold made it far?" Silas considered the question carefully. "Depends how quickly trouble found him." Bonnie studied his expression. "You say that like you've seen it happen before." Silas finally glanced toward her. "I've seen a lot of things start quietly." Bonnie nodded slowly. "And end loud?" Silas didn't answer. Deputy Elin Rowe returned just before dusk. Her patrol SUV crunched slowly across the icy road and stopped beside the house. The engine idled for a moment before she stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. She entered without ceremony. "Search team checked the lake trail," she said. Silas turned from the window. "And?" "Nothing yet." She removed her gloves and flexed her fingers, warming them near the stove. "But we did find something else." Bonnie looked up from the puppies. "What?" Elin reached into her coat pocket and placed a small object on the table. A metal key. Old. Brass-worn dull with age. Silas picked it up. "Where was it?" "Half-mile down the road," Rowe replied. "Near the old snowmobile access trail." Bonnie frowned. "That road hasn't been used much in years." "Exactly," Elin said. Silas turned the key in his fingers. It wasn't a house key, too small, more like something for a cabinet or a lockbox. He glanced toward the bedroom where the old cabinet still stood. "Harold carried this?" he asked. Rowe shrugged. "No idea." Bonnie leaned closer. "That looks familiar." Silas raised an eyebrow. "From where?" Bonnie hesitated. "Harold used to keep a small shed behind the property years ago. He stored tools there when he fixed radios for folks around town." Silas looked toward the back window. "I didn't see a shed." Bonnie shook her head. "Collapsed during a storm maybe 15 years ago?" Deputy Rowe folded her arms. "Or buried under snow now." Outside, the wind had begun to rise. The trees beyond the road whispered together in slow waves of movement. Snow shifted along the ground in thin ribbons as the temperature continued to fall. Silas pulled on his coat. "Let's check it." Bonnie blinked. "Now?" Silas nodded. "If Harold dropped that key yesterday, whatever it opens might still matter." Deputy Rowe grabbed her flashlight. "I'll go." Bonnie looked toward Era. The dog had lifted her head again. Not in alarm, but alert. Silas crouched beside her briefly. "You staying here?" Era blinked slowly. Her tail thumped once against the rug, as if approving the plan. The 3 of them stepped into the cold. Night was arriving quickly now, turning the snow from white to blue-gray. Deputy Rowe led the way with the flashlight beam cutting across the drifts. Silas walked slightly ahead, scanning the ground. His boots sank into powder that had blown across the road since morning. "Trail's this way," Rowe said, pointing toward a narrow path cutting between the trees. The beam of her flashlight bounced across frozen branches and patches of ice beneath the snow. They moved slowly. The world had grown very quiet again. Bonnie walked carefully behind them, breathing hard, but refusing to complain. Harold always said this trail led to the old radio tower, she said between breaths. Silas glanced back. Radio tower? Forest Service built one decades ago. It's long gone now. Rose's flashlight swept ahead. There, a dark shape emerged beneath a heavy mound of snow near the edge of the clearing. Wood, half buried, the collapsed remains of an old structure. Silas knelt and brushed snow away with his gloved hands. A small door frame appeared beneath the drift. Deputy Rose stepped closer. You think that's it? Silas examined the rusted lock attached to the broken boards. He slid the brass key into the hole. It turned. As the lock clicked open, a low sound carried through the trees. Not wind, not snow shifting, a dog's bark. Silas froze. Bonnie looked around nervously. That's not Era. Deputy Rowe tilted her head. The bark came again, distant, echoing across the frozen forest. Silas stood slowly. That's a working dog, he said quietly. Rowe frowned. How can you tell? The rhythm, Silas replied. Another bark sounded, closer now. Then the beam of Rowe's flashlight caught movement between the trees. A man stepped into the clearing. Tall, broad-shouldered, a German shepherd walked beside him on a long leash. The dog was younger than Era, perhaps 3 years old, with a thick black saddle coat and strong muscular frame built for tracking. Its ears stood sharply forward, eyes bright with focus as it scanned the strangers in the clearing. The man holding the leash raised a hand. Easy there, he said calmly. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone used to handling animals and people in tense situations. He approached slowly. The beam of Rose's flashlight revealed a man in his late 30s, about 6 feet tall, wearing a dark work jacket dusted with snow and heavy boots suited for long hours outdoors. His face was clean-shaven, with strong features softened by a calm expression. Dark brown hair fell loosely beneath a knit cap. His eyes moved quickly across the scene, taking everything in. Deputy Rowe lowered her flashlight slightly. Gideon? The man nodded. Evening, Elin. Bonnie looked surprised. You know him? Rowe gestured toward the man. Gideon Thorne. Runs the garage near Main Street. Gideon stepped closer. His gaze settled briefly on Silas. You must be the Navy guy everyone's been talking about. Silas nodded once. You heard about Harold? Gideon's expression shifted. Word travels fast in small towns. He glanced at the broken shed door. You find something? Silas gestured toward the lock. About to. Gideon nodded thoughtfully. Well, he said calmly, tightening his grip on the dog's leash. Mind if I take a look too? His German shepherd sat obediently beside him, still watching, still silent. Silas studied the man carefully. Something about Gideon's arrival felt timed, but timing in small towns was often coincidence. Still, Silas turned back to the shed. Let's see what Harold left behind. The broken shed smelled like old metal and forgotten winters. Silas Boone pushed the warped wooden door open with slow pressure, the hinges groaning in protest as packed snow cracked loose from the frame. The small structure leaned slightly into the wind as if it had spent years resisting collapse and was now reconsidering the effort. Inside, the beam of Deputy Elin Rowe's flashlight cut through a haze of dust and frost. The shed had once been a working space. A narrow wooden workbench ran along the far wall, cluttered with the remains of tools that had not moved in years. Screwdrivers worn smooth by decades of use, coils of thin copper wire, a soldering iron whose cord had stiffened with age. A rusted metal cabinet stood crooked against the back wall. Shelves sagged beneath small cardboard boxes labeled in faded marker. Radio parts, vacuum tubes, weathered instruction manuals. The room told the quiet story of Harold Voss before age had slowed his hands. Bonnie Kessler stepped inside carefully, brushing snow from her sleeves. Her eyes moved across the bench and tools with something close to affection. He used to fix radios for half the town out here, she said softly. Her voice echoed slightly against the wooden walls. Before the hardware store started selling cheap replacements, people used to bring him everything. I pick up everything. Car radios, farm receivers, even the old police sets when the station couldn't afford new equipment. Silas crouched near the workbench, examining the floor. Snow had blown into the shed through the cracked boards. Beneath it, faint disturbances in the dust suggested someone had moved around recently. Not days ago, hours. Deputy Rowe noticed it too. "Someone's been here," she murmured. Silas nodded. "Recently." Behind them, Gideon Thorne remained near the doorway. He stood with the relaxed posture of a man who was comfortable in cold places. His work jacket, dark and worn along the sleeves, carried faint grease stains that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. His hands rested loosely near the leash he held. Beside him sat the German Shepherd. The dog was alert without tension. Its coat carried the classic working dog pattern of black saddle over tanned shoulders and legs. Strong, healthy muscles showed beneath the fur, and the dog's amber eyes moved calmly across the shed as if cataloging everything. Not aggressive, just attentive. "What's his name?" Silas asked. Gideon glanced down. "Atlas." The dog flicked an ear at the sound. 3 years old, Gideon added. "Mostly helps around the garage. Keeps me company on long nights." Silas nodded slightly. Atlas had the calm confidence of a dog raised with discipline and patience. Very different from the exhausted determination Era had shown earlier. Different lives, different battles. Silas turned his attention back to the workbench. A small wooden box sat near the center. Unlike the other items in the shed, this one had been wiped clean recently. No frost clung to its surface. Silas lifted the lid. Inside lay several envelopes bound together with twine. Deputy Rowe leaned closer. "Letters?" Silas untied the twine slowly. Most of the envelopes were empty, but one contained a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was steady but aged. Harold's. Silas read silently for a moment, then again. Deputy Rowe noticed the change in his expression. "What does it say?" Silas handed the letter to her. Rowe read aloud quietly. "If someone finds this, it means the timing was wrong again. I kept thinking I could solve it quietly, but quiet solutions don't always stay quiet in a small town." Bonnie looked confused. What was he solving? Silas pointed to the bottom of the page. Rowe read the last line slowly. "The problem is not the man who will come looking. The problem is the truth he thinks he already knows." Silas leaned back against the workbench. "That's an odd thing to write." Bonnie frowned. "Harold never liked mysteries." Gideon shifted slightly near the doorway. Maybe he wasn't writing for himself. Silas glanced toward him. "For who?" Gideon shrugged. "Someone who was supposed to read it." Silence filled the shed again. Wind scraped lightly across the roof. Atlas suddenly stood. The dog moved toward the far corner of the shed, nose low, sniffing along the floorboards. His movements were careful, deliberate. Silas watched him closely. "What's he doing?" Gideon stepped forward a little. Following a scent, Deputy Rowe lifted the flashlight beam. Atlas stopped beside a section of loose boards near the back wall. The dog pawed once at the wood. Then again, Atlas let out a single low whine. Not loud, but unmistakable. Silas crouched beside the dog and pulled one of the boards loose. Cold air rushed upward from the gap. Beneath the boards lay a narrow compartment carved into the dirt floor. Inside it rested a small metal box. Old, heavy. The lid bore scratches from years of use. Silas lifted it carefully. The box was locked. Deputy Rowe held up the brass key they had found earlier. Silas inserted it. The lock turned easily. The lid opened with a soft metallic click. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, a folded map of Pine Vale, and a small cassette tape labeled in Harold's handwriting. Silas stared at the photograph first. It showed a younger Harold standing beside another man. The second man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a mechanic's jacket with grease-darkened sleeves. His face was turned slightly toward the camera, revealing a familiar shape to his jaw. Silas slowly turned the photo toward the light. Deputy Rowe leaned closer. Bonnie gasped softly. "Good Lord." Silas looked toward Gideon. The man standing beside Harold in the photograph looked almost exactly like him. Younger, but unmistakable. Gideon stepped closer. "Let me see that." Silas handed him the photograph. Gideon studied it carefully. His expression remained calm, but the stillness in his posture had changed. "That's my father," he said quietly. Bonnie blinked. I thought your father left town years ago. Gideon nodded. He did. Silas folded his arms. You didn't mention he knew Harold. Gideon's eyes remained on the photograph. My father knew a lot of people in this town. Deputy Rowe spoke gently. When did he leave? 22 years ago, Gideon replied. And you haven't heard from him since? Gideon shook his head. Not once. Silas studied him carefully, and Harold kept a picture of him hidden under the floor. Gideon looked up. That's what it looks like. Bonnie stepped back slowly. This doesn't make sense, she murmured. Harold never talked about Gideon's father. Deputy Rowe picked up the cassette tape from the box. The label carried 2 words. For later, Silas turned the folded map over in his hands. Several locations in Pine Vale had been circled in red ink. The garage on Main Street, the Lake Road, and Harold's house. Silas felt the quiet weight of something larger settling into place. Harold had not simply disappeared in a snowstorm. He had been preparing for something. Maybe for years. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Snow shifted across the clearing, slowly covering their footprints. Silas closed the metal box carefully. Deputy, he said. Rowe looked up. I think Harold was trying to protect something. Bonnie glanced nervously toward the trees. From who? Silas looked toward Gideon. That's what we still need to figure out. Gideon stared at the photograph again. The calm expression he usually carried had faded slightly now, not replaced by anger, but by something quieter. Recognition. Maybe, he said slowly, the problem isn't who Harold was hiding from. Silas waited. Gideon looked toward the dark forest beyond the shed. Maybe the problem is who finally decided to come back. The wind carried through the trees again, and somewhere beyond the frozen road, Pinevale continued its silent watch beneath the falling snow. Night closed in around the old shed with a quiet certainty, the kind of darkness that winter brought to northern towns, thick, steady, and patient. Snow moved softly across the clearing in thin streams under the rising wind. The broken boards of the shed creaked now and then, adjusting to the cold, as though the building itself remembered a time when it had been stronger. Inside, the small group stood around the open metal box. No one spoke for a moment. The photograph still rested in Gideon Thorne's hands. The younger man in the image, his father, stood beside Harold Voss with an arm resting casually on the hood of an old pickup truck. Behind them, a faded radio antenna tower rose above the trees. Gideon stared at the picture longer than anyone expected. His normally calm expression had tightened slightly. The lines of his face, strong jaw, straight nose, dark eyes sharpened by years of practical work, remained controlled, but something inside him had shifted. My father hated photographs, he said quietly. Silas leaned against the workbench. That's so? Gideon nodded slowly. He said pictures froze people in time, made it harder to forget things. Deputy Elin Rowe crossed her arms. That's an unusual philosophy. Gideon folded the photograph carefully. My father had a lot of unusual philosophies. Bonnie Kessler stepped closer, peering at the image again. Harold never mentioned him, she murmured. Silas reached for the cassette tape from the box. The label was simple. For later, Harold's handwriting was steady despite age. Silas turned the tape over thoughtfully. Well, he said quietly, it's later now. The old cassette recorder from Harold's house had been brought along. Deputy Rowe placed it on the workbench and slid the tape inside. The machine clicked softly as the lid closed. For a second, nothing happened. Then the motor hummed, static crackled through the small speaker. The group instinctively leaned closer. Harold's voice emerged slowly from the noise. Thin, older, but unmistakably his. If you're hearing this, I guess the snow finally caught up with me. Bonnie pressed her lips together. Silas watched Gideon carefully. The recording continued. I tried to handle it quietly. Thought if I waited long enough, the past would stay buried the way winter buries roads nobody uses anymore. The tape hissed briefly. But the trouble with buried things is they don't disappear. They just wait. Silas glanced toward Deputy Rowe. Her eyes remained fixed on the recorder. Harold's voice softened. Gideon, if you're the one hearing this, then I'm sorry. Gideon's head lifted. His hand tightened slightly around the photograph. Atlas suddenly rose from the floor. The German shepherd's ears snapped upright. his body going completely still. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Gideon turned. Atlas walked toward the shed door, nose lifted slightly toward the wind. Not barking, not growling, just listening. Then he stepped forward and placed himself directly between Gideon and the open doorway, blocking the entrance. Silas frowned. "That dog always do that?" Gideon shook his head slowly. "Only when he thinks someone's watching." No one moved. The wind outside rattled the broken boards again, but nothing else appeared in the clearing. After several seconds, Atlas relaxed slightly and returned to Gideon's side. The tension eased, but not completely. Silas glanced toward the dark forest, then back to the recorder. "Let's hear the rest." Harold's voice continued. "Your father wasn't a bad man." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. He just made one mistake that couldn't be taken back. The tape crackled again. 22 years ago, he came to me with a problem. Said some men were looking for something they believed he had taken. Silas leaned forward. "What men?" Bonnie whispered. The recording answered slowly. "He never told me their names." Another pause. "But he said if they ever came to Pine Vale, they would come quietly." Deputy Rowe exchanged a glance with Silas. Harold's voice continued. "He left town the next morning. Said it would keep everyone safe if people believed he'd run." Gideon's eyes remained locked on the recorder now. The tape carried the faint sound of Harold shifting in his chair when the recording had been made. "He asked me to keep something safe." Silas looked toward the metal box. "I told him I would." The wind outside howled briefly, shaking the shed. Then the voice returned. "But now someone's looking again." Bonnie whispered, "Good Lord." Harold's voice lowered. "And if they find what your father left behind, Pinevale won't stay quiet anymore." The tape clicked softly. Silence filled the shed again. No one spoke for several seconds. Snow brushed against the roof. Silas exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "that clears up a few things." Deputy Rowe raised an eyebrow. "Does it?" Silas nodded. Harold didn't disappear because of a storm. He tapped the metal box. He disappeared because someone came looking. Gideon stood very still. "My father never mentioned anything like this." Bonnie folded her arms nervously. "Maybe he didn't want you involved." Silas studied Gideon. Or maybe he thought he had solved the problem. Deputy Rowe glanced toward the open doorway. "But someone else doesn't think it's solved." Silas checked the map again. 3 locations circled. Harold's house, the lake road, and Gideon's garage. Silas looked up. "That's not random." Gideon frowned. "What do you mean?" Silas pointed to the last circle. "Your garage sits right on the highway coming into town." Gideon nodded slowly. So if someone wanted to watch Pinevale without drawing attention," Silas let the thought hang. Gideon finished it. "They'd start there." Deputy Rowe stepped closer to the map. "Have you noticed anyone unusual around the garage?" Gideon hesitated. "Couple travelers stopped through this week." "What kind of travelers?" 2 men in a silver sedan." Silas and Roby exchanged a look, the same car Bonnie had mentioned earlier. Gideon noticed the exchange immediately. "What?" Silas folded the map again. "Nothing confirmed yet." Bonnie shook her head slowly. "This town used to be simple." Silas gave a faint half-smile. "Nothing's simple once people start digging for old secrets." The recorder clicked again unexpectedly. Everyone turned. The tape had not finished. Harold's voice returned one last time. Quieter now, almost tired. "If things go wrong, trust the dog." Silas blinked. Bonnie frowned. "What dog?" Gideon looked toward Atlas, but the German shepherd simply sat calmly beside him. The tape ended with a soft mechanical stop. Silas picked up the recorder slowly. "Harold trusted animals more than people." Bonnie nodded. "That sounds like him." Deputy Rowe stepped toward the door. "We should get back to town." Silas glanced toward the forest again. The night had grown deeper. Wind erased their footprints across the clearing almost as quickly as they made them. But something about the woods felt different now. Not hostile, just aware. Silas slipped the cassette back into the metal box. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we start figuring out what Harold was protecting." Gideon looked at the photograph of his father again. The expression in his eyes had changed, not confusion anymore, something closer to resolve. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the frozen road and the silent trees, Pinevale continued to wait beneath the falling snow. The night after the recording did not pass quickly. It stretched across Pinevale like a long-held breath. Silas Boone did not sleep. The small living room of Harold Voss's house had become a temporary command post without anyone formally declaring it so. The old wooden table held the metal box, the map with red circles, the photograph of Harold and Gideon's father, and the cassette recorder that had already been played twice more since returning from the shed. Outside, the temperature had dropped even further. The cold had the kind of sharp edge that made even quiet sounds travel far across the frozen air. The forest beyond the road looked darker than usual, the trees forming a black wall beneath a pale moon that kept slipping behind the slow-moving clouds. Inside the house, warmth held. The stove glowed softly. A lantern burned low near the table. The room smelled faintly of broth, wood smoke, and wet dog fur. Era lay near the heater again. Her body still showed the fatigue of birth and hunger, but the change in her posture from 2 days earlier was remarkable. The German shepherd's black and tan coat had begun to regain its shape, her thick winter fur drying fully now. Her ribs still showed slightly beneath the coat, but the strength in her shoulders was unmistakable. She watched the room with steady amber eyes. Beside the heater, the cardboard box held the 2 puppies. They were stronger now. Small squeaks emerged from beneath the towels every so often, and once in a while one of the tiny bodies would crawl blindly toward the warmth of its sibling. Life had returned to them slowly. Bonnie Kessler sat near the table with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The kind-faced woman, now nearing 60, had the posture of someone who had lived long enough to know when events were about to reshape a town. She studied the map again. "I still don't understand why Harold circled your garage," she said quietly to Gideon. Gideon Thorne stood near the window. The tall mechanic had removed his heavy work jacket and now wore a dark thermal shirt that revealed the strong, practical build earned through years of lifting engines and machinery. His dark hair fell slightly across his forehead now that his knit cap had been removed. His face remained thoughtful. "My father built half the electrical systems in Pine Vale before he left," Gideon said. Silas leaned back in the chair across from him. "That includes your garage?" Gideon nodded. "And the old radio tower near the lake." Deputy Elin Rowe stood beside the door, arms folded. Her patrol coat hung open now, revealing the dark uniform beneath. Her sharp gray eyes moved between each of them as if measuring the truth of every sentence spoken in the room. "So Harold knew the same systems your father built," she said. "Yes. And someone thinks those systems still matter." Silas tapped the map once, enough to come looking after 22 years. The room fell quiet again. Then Era lifted her head. Silas noticed immediately. The dog had not moved suddenly, just slowly, but her ears were forward now, listening. Silas stood. "What is it?" Bonnie looked up. "Maybe the puppies?" But Era did not look toward the box, her gaze fixed on the door. A low, soft rumble vibrated in her chest, not fear, warning. Silas stepped toward the window. The road outside was empty. Snow drifted across the surface in thin white waves. But something in the distance caught his eye. 2 faint headlights, moving slowly along the road. Deputy Rowe came beside him. "That's not a local car," she said quietly. Silas watched the lights approach. The vehicle stopped near the edge of the property. Engine idling. No one stepped out. Era stood, not quickly, deliberately. Her posture had changed entirely now. The exhaustion of the past 2 days had disappeared beneath a focused stillness that Silas recognized instantly. The dog walked to the door and sat, facing it, waiting. Silas looked down at her. "You know something we don't?" Era did not look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the door. Outside, the car engine shut off. The sudden silence made the night feel even colder. Then a single car door opened. Footsteps approached through the snow. Bonnie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Please tell me that's not who we think it is." Deputy Rowe rested her hand lightly near her radio. Silas reached for the doorknob. Only one way to find out. The door opened slowly. Cold air spilled inside. A man stood on the porch. He was older than Silas had expected, perhaps in his early 60s. Tall, broad-shouldered despite the weight of age. His gray hair fell loosely to his collar beneath a worn wool hat. His beard, thick and silver, framed a weathered face marked by deep lines carved by wind and years of travel. But his eyes were the most striking feature. Sharp, alert, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime watching for danger. He removed his gloves slowly. "Evening," the man said calmly. His voice carried the quiet steadiness of someone used to speaking in difficult situations. Gideon stepped forward suddenly. The photograph still rested in his hand. "Dad?" The word hung in the air. The man studied Gideon carefully. Recognition flickered across his face. "Wow." "Gideon," Bonnie gasped softly. Deputy Rowe blinked once, stunned. Silas did not move. The man stepped inside. Snow melted from his boots onto the wooden floor. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said quietly to Gideon. Gideon's voice carried a mix of disbelief and anger. "You disappeared for 22 years. The man nodded once. "Yes." Silas finally spoke. "You're Elias Thorne." The older man looked toward him. "And you must be the soldier Harold mentioned." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You knew he'd talk about me?" Elias Thorne stepped further into the room. His gaze moved slowly across the table, the photograph, the map, the cassette recorder. Then toward Era. The dog remained sitting by the door, watching him, not growling, not relaxed, just studying. Elias nodded slightly toward her. "Good dog." Silas folded his arms. "You came back at a very interesting time." Elias met his gaze. "That's because the people looking for me came back first." The room went silent again. Gideon's voice broke the quiet. "You owe us an explanation." Elias looked toward the map. "I owe you the truth." He sat slowly in one of the chairs. The chair creaked beneath his weight. 22 years ago, he began, I discovered something hidden in the old radio network beneath Pine Vale. Deputy Rowe leaned forward slightly. "What kind of something?" Elias gave a faint smile that carried no humor. "The kind of thing people with money and patience would kill to control." Silas glanced at Era again. The dog had not moved, still watching, still listening. Elias rested his hands on the table. "And if Harold is missing," he said quietly, "it means they have already started looking again." Outside, the wind swept across the frozen road. Inside the house, Pine Vale's long-buried story had finally begun to speak aloud. Every story like this reminds us of something simple but powerful. Sometimes the smallest life carries the greatest purpose. In the frozen silence of Pine Vale, when people had nearly lost hope, it was not power, wealth, or authority that revealed the truth. It was a starving mother dog, Era, who refused to give up. Weak, exhausted, and nearly out of strength, she still chose to trust. She carried her puppy through the snow and placed her hope in the path of a man she had never met. Moments like that remind us that miracles rarely arrive in loud or obvious ways. Sometimes God sends them quietly, through a stranger who stops to help, through a mom that refuses to abandon her young, through a moment of courage when someone chooses compassion instead of turning away. Silas Boone believed he was simply rescuing a dog and her puppies. But in truth, that moment was part of something larger. It brought together people who had been separated by time, secrets, and fear. It exposed the truth that had been buried for years. And it reminded an entire town that goodness still exists, even in the coldest seasons of life. Faith often works the same way in our own lives. We may not always see the plan. We may not understand why certain struggles appear in our path. But sometimes the very things that look like accidents are the quiet ways God guides us toward the people we are meant to help and the purpose we are meant to fulfill. Maybe that is the true lesson of this story. Kindness is never wasted. Courage does not have to be loud to be powerful. And even when the world feels cold, compassion can still lead us toward the light. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope still exists. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and whether you believe that animals sometimes become part of God's plan in our lives. And if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can discover these moments of faith, courage, and compassion. May God watch over you and your family, bring peace to your home, and bless every path you walk. Thank you for being here.